Will more than two banks fail? Is it time to buy gold? Recently, the FDIC took over two banks that were in trouble. Now we have reports that an additional 20 regional banks have in excess of $650 billion in bond losses. The Fed admits that their increase in interest rates have done little to bring inflation under control. They may well increase the amount and frequency of interest rates. Isn't it time to consider gold in your portfolio? From January 1st, 2023 to today, the price of gold is up twice as much as the S&P 500. Go to blacksandwhites.us, click on the gold bar, and reach out to Advisors Metals and ask Ira, is gold right for you? Call now. It's important. Welcome to Black and White, a conversation with Dan Perkins. It's time to bring all of us together to talk about the issues that concern us. It's time to hear from people who want to deal with only the facts. And it's time for you, as Americans, to re-engage in your right of freedom of speech. It's time for you to join me in the conversation on Blacks and Whites. Welcome back to Blacks and Whites, and we have a phenomenal guest, Richard Lyons, who has written two books, The DNA of Democracy, Volume 1, and The Shadows of the Acropolis, Volume 2. Amazing titles. Richard, thank you for joining us today.
Now, very happy to be with you, Dan.
We had a brief conversation before the show started, trying to find out if there were limits that I had to fall into for Richard, and there are no limits, whatever you want to talk about. So first of all, let's just spend a moment quickly to introduce you to our audience. Tell us about Richard Lyons.
Well, Dan, I grew up in a family of printers. My grandfather was a printer, and my father was a printer who later became an educational publisher. So I've been raised in the educational publishing world. I worked in the shipping department and on the presses and in the pre-press of a printing company devoted to, one of the companies was developmental learning materials for special ed kids, and the other was Argus Communications, which was based on religious education. So having had that background and having a love for literature and history, I embarked, after we sold a majority of the business, I embarked on an individual career as a writer and indie publisher.
What brought you to write these two stories?
Well, probably like you, Dan, and like a lot of your viewers and listeners, some 8 years ago, perhaps, I had just finished a book quite different from these. I was startled by the difference I noted in how our government was conducting itself. I saw some statistics which amazed me. One was that during the Obama presidency, 20,000 rules came out of executive agencies with the force of law from persons who had lifetime appointments in jobs that no one ever knew of. Nobody knew their names, nobody knew their function, other than lobbyists who could create influence for their clients. At the same time, only 400 laws were passed out of our legislature per the Constitution. So you have 20,000 laws being created by agencies of persons nobody even knows, and only 400 being created by persons who were actually elected at the federal level.
Right.
So I thought, and then I was listening as the administration at that time under Obama was insulting everybody they could insult in the free enterprise system, and claiming that they really don't work for a living. The government is responsible for success in America. And these sorts of things just sent up red flags. And I said to myself, I don't really know if people in America know how our government was really founded and why, how and why. So I got to the book. I decided to create a book called The DNA of Democracy, which through narrative story goes back to Greece, it goes back to Rome, it goes back to Britain, and all those elements of their democracies and constitutional republics and constitutional monarchies, which formed elements of our own Constitution. And then I go into the Revolution in America, the Constitutional Convention, the Civil War, and the suffragette movement in the early 1900s to show how America's Constitution was formed and why, and how it works well if we work under the Constitution. So having done that, and I think it's a great read, it's approachable for anybody of any age range above high school. And then I undertook this book, and this is what has happened. It's called Shadows of the Acropolis, and it is a tale of a different kind. It's the opposite. It's how government has concentrated in Washington, D.C. over the past 100 years, and how powers have been taken from localities and states, from families and individuals, up to the federal level and into the federal level, and taken from our representatives in the House and Senate and put into the executive branch in agencies, and how it's contrary to our original design. And in fact, Dan, it reminds me, as I was researching it, of the very revolution I wrote about in DNA of Democracy, and how the government of England was a ministerial tyranny, and how our founders of this country fought against that same kind of tyranny.
So I don't usually do this so early in the show, but I feel compelled to do it. How can people buy these books? Where?
Well, you can get them in Amazon, of course. You can ask for them at any retail store or at a library. And you can go to richardclyons.com and purchase it there. We have a secure shop there.
Wonderful. I want to talk about your opinion of what you think happened, and were there specific events that happened that changed our country, hopefully not forever, but have had a significant impact on who we are as America?
Yeah, that's where Shadows of the Acropolis begins, where we depart from our constitutional underpinnings. And it began with Woodrow Wilson, who was a professor on Ivy League campuses his whole life. And his ideal state was actually that of Friedrich Hegel, a German philosopher responsible for ideal state theory. And Woodrow Wilson was a believer in his form of government, which was also the form of government believed in by Karl Marx. It has to do, there's a difference between John Locke's philosophy of the individual, where everybody's rights are granted from God, and then Woodrow Wilson's derivation from Friedrich Hegel, that the individual should be assumed by the state. His rights should be assumed by the state, because the state is the greater societal form than the individual. It's an inverse relationship. John Locke believed the individual's rights were sacrosanct and from God. In Friedrich Hegel's and Woodrow Wilson's assumptions, those rights are dictated by the state. So right there was a difference in the governing philosophy. He greatly expanded the executive branch in contravention with George Washington's example through the Revolutionary War and with the Constitutional Convention, that he did all things based on the will of the civilian assembly. And then two critical amendments occurred during his presidency. One was the 16th, which was the income tax, which provided for a central treasury from which all the wealth of the states was gathered into one place, and then the party in office was responsible for who got money back, right? That puts tremendous power in Washington right off the bat. The second thing he did was the 17th Amendment, whereby senators of states were not elected by the legislatures of states any longer. They were elected by the people, right? What does that do? It removes from the legislatures of the states the will to defend the states from a federal power. So in those two movements alone, it gave much more authority to Washington, which could dictate then to senators, this is what we're going to do for your state, rather than states defending themselves and their prerogatives.
You think there's been some discussion about going and repealing the 17th Amendment and going back to having senators appointed by the state legislature?
Voted into office by their legislatures rather than by the common public. It's not, I don't know that needs to be repealed. It just needs to be understood that states need to defend themselves from an overreaching federal authority. Since that time, that hasn't even been a concept. Prior to that time, it had been a cornerstone of the Constitution.
So Wilson was the force behind the 16th and the 17th Amendment.
Yeah.
Anybody else who was a center of influence that brought about this adverse change?
Well, then one of his great admirers was FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. He was actually Wilson's Secretary of the Navy during World War I. And of course, FDR is a great character. but his idea of America was very different from the idea of our founders. And when the occasion came of the Depression, he took that as an occasion to expand the power of the federal government by invading actually the economy and developing constituencies within the Democratic Party that became from that point forward dependent on government largesse. So if you have any sort of constituency, the Democratic Party was taking control of certain segments of society by ensuring they were dependent on federal outlays.
Got about a minute and a half before we have to go to a break, but
Sure.
if we just take those first two examples, I know there's a third that you want to talk about, Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society.
Yeah.
But in the two, can you look into your book and determine what was the impact on the Black community in this country by those two presidents?
Well, Wilson was notorious because he was the first president to segregate Washington, D.C. And then just subsequent to FDR began the housing program, which leveled an area of Washington, D.C. called West Adams, which was a very prosperous, very integrated area of Washington, D.C., predominantly African-American. Predominantly, there were independent African-American businesses throughout that area that the bulldozers literally leveled at the time, just after FDR, when the housing program that he initiated took root. And so put everybody in the area of West Adams who had a business prior to that and had a home into projects and without a job. So those are two. Yeah, it's an unwritten history that I've found, that I've written in The Shadows of the Acropolis, because it literally invaded the free enterprise system, family life, the welfare of individuals, their very homes, and bulldozed.
Amazing. We're talking to Richard Lyons, who has two books, and are available, you said, at Amazon and also on your site.
Yes, richardclyons.com.
Okay.
That's right, Dan.
We'll be right back after these messages. Inflation for most people is causing them to use their credit cards to try and make up for income shortfalls. How big is this problem? In the second quarter of 2022, Americans added $46 billion to their credit card balances. Some of that could be you. The Federal Reserve Consumer Credit Report showed that the rate of interest on credit cards went from 14.56 to 16.65%. Those Americans struggling with credit card debt saw their delinquency rates escalate from 1.66% to 1.81%. The Cambridge Debt Consolidation Program may be able to help you reduce the interest rates by 2/3 and cut your time to pay off the debt from 30 years to as little as 5 years. If you're struggling and you want professional and objective help getting your credit house in order, then call 1-855-435-2066 or come back, and we're having a fascinating conversation with Richard Lyons, who has a couple of books. Let's show the audience the books, if you would, please.
Sure. Dan, this is The DNA of Democracy, and it's about the formation of America, the why and the how of how we were formed based on previous democracies. And they're like the Magna Carta or the Athenian Constitution or Rome's 12 Tables or the Common Law of England. And then there's a second book called Shadows of the Acropolis, which carries on after The DNA of Democracy. The DNA of Democracy shows how America diffused power and put it in the hands of the individual. This book talks about how those powers are being taken into Washington, D.C. over the past 100 years, where power and wealth is concentrating, infringing on our liberties. I'll put it that way.
In the first part of our discussion, you were talking about Woodrow Wilson and FDR.
Yeah.
And you said there was a third person, and that was Lyndon Johnson with the Great Society.
Yes.
Talk about why you picked him.
Well, I have to go back a little bit to go forward.
Okay.
Woodrow Wilson famously said that during his presidency, the Russian Revolution was going on, and socialism had been a cause célèbre of the intelligentsia of America since the 1880s, when Karl Marx, his influence started spreading, and ideal state theory. Well, that theory, FDR was also a believer in that sort of administrative state And LBJ was a successor to the same idea. When he began his administration after the tragic death of John Kennedy, which I think we all agree changed the country, he populated his administration with Ivy League, he called them the Harvards, Ivy League professors who believed in social, created what's called the Great Society. And in that, whereas Woodrow Wilson had invaded the Constitution to expand the power of the executive branch, and FDR had invaded the free enterprise system to create a command and control apparatus in Washington, D.C., LBJ literally invaded the family, and foremost the African-American family, through the housing program and through the welfare state, and devastated it with horrible results. Dan, if you just look at 2020, we have spent $23 trillion on the Great Society. And if it worked in 2020, we wouldn't have had 200 cities burned to the ground and the ensuing looting that occurred. People wouldn't be miserably unhappy in our urban areas. They would be celebrating, but this Great Society has done the opposite of a good thing.
It appears to me that under the Johnson administration, as we spoke earlier in the program, the Harvard elites, the white elitists,
yes,
were the people who were telling the Black people what was best for them. And that's what
yes.
FDR did and Wilson. They decided that the Black people in this country were not capable of making decisions about how they should live their lives and what they should be doing.
The Democrat, as I put it, and not a lot of people are going to like hearing this, the Democratic Party became the new massa of the African-American society. And it's been the case till this day. They took over how the African-American in urban America was housed. They took over what they would eat. They took over the money that they have to clothe themselves. They took over their schools. They took away their churches during the housing program. As I did my research, it was just tragic as I kept going on and finding this. Previous to the housing program in America, African-American areas of urban America were successful. They were integrated. They had African-American owned businesses. I go into that in the shadows of the Acropolis. There was an area of Detroit that had some 182 independent African-American operated businesses. And because of the housing program, those were all left. And in its place came all the sort of chains that you see, the McDonald's chain, the Jack in the Box, so that all the entrepreneurship of the society was driven out. And in place of the churches, there was nothing left. The whole of what I call the American arch, or the original powers of America, that is family and faith and associations and enterprises and how you influence your local school. All of that was driven out of the areas where the African Americans were densely populated.
Richard, what I've never been able to understand, and I had worked in the civil rights movement in Columbus, Ohio for a number of years. I never understood why regularly, year after year after year, decade after decade, Democrats would make promises to Black people to get elected, but when they got elected, they didn't do anything they promised. And so I figured, you could get away with that once, maybe twice, but for 50 years, 60 years, 70 years,
it's been since, yeah.
And so I look at what's going on today, and I've written a number of pieces about that, and that is this idea of reparations. And I wrote a piece that got the biggest response of anything I've ever written in probably 20 years. And I said in that piece, the African American and Black American people are being manipulated with the idea that if you live in San Francisco, for example, you could get a check for $5 million. And I said,
it's the lottery.
Pardon me?
They're promising that they can win the lottery.
Right. And so I've said in several articles that the reality is that if you have 50,000, and things change because some people now say all blacks should get checks. Other people are saying blacks who were have a history of slavery should get the checks. Right now, the black population is approximately 1 in 5 black people whose heritage does not reside in the United States. They were not born here. They were born someplace else. So are you going to create a further division between the black community of the blacks who want and the blacks who aren't going to get? Then I said the practical reality, I've been involved in managing money for over 50 years. To give a poor person any significant amount of money, I have seen too many studies.
It's catastrophic.
It's gone in a very short period of time.
And it harms their life.
Oh yeah, it does.
They used to not working for a living.
And so I look at that and I say, but I see these pictures and videos of black people standing up at board meetings. I want my $3 million check. This morning I read an article where there was a man who was before one of these committees. He says, black people don't care about shootings. They don't care about the police. They don't care about jobs and everything else. They just want their $3 million.
They've been horribly used. And it's a tragedy because if you go back to the 1940s, they were integrated in the urban areas with the Italian community, the Irish community, all the different communities. They were not segregated. When they did the housing program, they were segregated into an area of every city. And in that area, there was no place to have opportunity. Right. And so, but here's they want reparations. I think the Democratic Party should be the party to give them reparations. The party itself, persons who are Democrats, because it's the Democratic Party who, since the age of slavery, they were the party that defended slavery. They were the copper Democrats of the North who railed against Lincoln throughout the Civil War. They were the ones who came up with Jim Crow law. They were the ones who came up with the housing programs. They were the ones who came up with the Great Society that devastated the African-American family. And because the African-American family is devastated, they need to be dependent on the federal government. And so the hook is $3 million, which is a promise that will never be kept.
Right. And
it is an horrendous treatment.
I'm writing a commentary right now about Gavin Newsom and his game that he was playing with the black community. He was for the discussion of reparations, but when the numbers started coming out and he's already $30 billion short in his operating budget, he couldn't handle $680 million or $800 million or whatever the number is. So he said that reparation has to be more than just money. And I said at the time when I wrote the commentary, I said when I wrote the commentary, I said, look for Gavin Newsom probably in the fall to decide that he's going to declare for president, and he's going to say, because he's going to veto the legislation if it comes through the legislature in California of $3 to $5 million. He's going to veto that, but he's going to say when he's running for president what happened this week when we had one of the leaders of the radical left saying that she's going to introduce legislation to make $14 trillion available for reparations. And
does she have that amount of money, Dan?
No, she thinks the federal government should pay for it. And Gavin Newsom will say, absolutely, the federal government is going to pay for it. Takes him off the hook. And I just think that the abuse of the black people in this country, and they can't see that it's the white supremacists that are doing it, blows my mind.
No, it's not white supremacists. It's the Democratic Party.
It's the Democratic Party.
Time and again, throughout history, the whole history of the country. They are the party that fought to protect slavery during the Civil War, that came out with Jim Crow laws, that came out with a housing program. They came out with a Great Society, which destroyed the African-American family and their entrepreneurial spirit and their work ethic. And we're supposed to thank these people. If they want reparations, they should pay them.
Right.
Democratic Party should. Yeah, open your pocket. Put your money where your mouth is.
Right. We've been having a fascinating conversation with Richard Lyons, who's got 2 books. Can we see those? You still got them?
Sure. Yeah. The DNA of Democracy, the how and why our country was made, and the Shadows of the Acropolis, the how and why our country has changed and why we all feel we're not living in the same place.
And they're available at Amazon.com, and your website is, and yours.
Yes, they are. You can bundle them on richardclyons.com and save some money, or they're at Amazon or retail outlets or at the local library.
Thank you for spending time with us today.
Thank you, Dan, very much.
My pleasure. We'll be right back. And we're out. Great interview.
Okay.
Do you have a website?
I do. It's richardclyons.com. So you can see.
Would you be interested in a copy of this interview?
Oh, yes, of course.
So as soon as I get it produced and aired, I will. I'll send you a copy. I might be a little delayed because I'm leaving on Sunday to go to London for 2 weeks for me and my wife's 55th wedding anniversary.
Oh, I envy you.
I'll try and get this up for production before I leave, but I've got a lot of shows to do. So thanks again. I'm going to have you on again as we get closer to see a resolution on this reparation issue. So thank you.
Yeah, it's criminal. It's, they try and move this whole population through hope and fear. They just, here, well, $3 million, right? And then, if you vote Republican, you're going to be back in chains. It's very common. They've been doing it for 50 years. I'm sick to death.
Thank you for your time.
Okay, Dan.
Thank you. Bye.
See you soon.
We are Americans, male and female, from many races and cultures from all over the world. One thing above all else is we are patriots who protect our nation and defend, when necessary, our Constitution from attacks both foreign and domestic. Today, as American patriots, we must take back our country from those who want to destroy it and us. We must start by taking back our children and their education. Parents, not unions, should be in charge of our children's education. We must be sure that they are taught about the greatness of America and its people. Our children should not be indoctrinated with the belief that parents are racist and are evil and trying to destroy the world. As patriots, we must take back our country from foreign nations who want to destroy us and our way of life. Yes, as patriots, we want America to be first. We want an open and fair trade policy, energy independence, safe cities, and secure borders where we can grow and prosper as a nation of free people. Become an American patriot. Help take back America by voting Republican. Thank you for joining us today, and we'd like to hear your comments or questions. So go to bwradionetwork.com. That's bwradionetwork.com and give us your questions or comments. And thanks for joining us today.